This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person or one country or one decision made overnight. This is about something quieter, something that has been happening slowly, deliberately, and mostly out of sight. For a long time, the world has been operating on an assumption so familiar it stopped feeling like an assumption at all. That the system underneath everything was stable, that it would always be there, that it could bend but not break. What just happened didn't shatter that system. It did something more dangerous. It proved the system can be exited, not loudly, not dramatically, but methodically. And once that possibility exists, once it's demonstrated, the rules change, even if nobody announces it. If you're tempted to click away because this sounds abstract, don't stay with me, because this is not about markets. It's about leverage. And it's already touching your life in ways you haven't been told to connect yet. And to understand why, we have to talk about who actually holds power now and how quietly that power has shifted. Power in this system is not held by presidents, not by elections, not even by governments in the way we usually imagine. Real control lives in plumbing, in settlement systems, in what is accepted automatically as payment. For decades, one thing sat at the center of that machinery, not because it was perfect, but because everyone agreed to use it. That agreement created gravity. Trade flowed toward it. Debt stacked around it. Entire economies organized themselves to stay close to it. And as long as that gravity held, the system looked natural, inevitable, permanent. But here's the reframing that matters. Control doesn't come from owning the system. It comes from being unable to leave it. The moment exit becomes possible, even for one major player, the balance shifts. Quietly, irreversibly. No alarms go off. No headlines explain it cleanly. But incentives start to move. Risk calculations change. And once that happens, loyalty to the old center becomes optional. Which brings us to the slow change everyone lived through without noticing until it was already normal. For most people, change feels dramatic when it's fast. Crashes, collapses, sudden breaks. But systems rarely fail that way. They fail by normalization. There was a time when running permanent deficits felt temporary, when borrowing was framed as an emergency tool, when printing money was described as extraordinary. Then it became routine. Year after year, the gap stayed open. Spending more than was earned stopped sounding dangerous and started sounding technical. Debt became a line item. Interest became background noise. And because nothing immediately broke, the assumption hardened. This must be sustainable. Before, the system depended on restraint. Now, it depends on belief. Belief that buyers will always show up. Belief that confidence can't be exhausted. Belief that consequences can be delayed indefinitely. That shift didn't happen in secret. It happened in plain sight. What changed wasn't policy. It was tolerance. And slow change is the most dangerous kind, because by the time it's noticed, reversing it feels unthinkable, which is why the first real shock doesn't look like collapse. It looks like a single move that exposes the weakness underneath. What finally breaks the calm isn't chaos, it's specificity, a concrete move, a measurable shift. One of the largest holders inside this system began reducing its exposure. Not all at once, not recklessly, but steadily, year after year. Hundreds of billions quietly moved out of what had long been treated as untouchable, the kind of asset everyone assumed would always be held, always be needed, always be safe. This wasn't panic. It was planning. And that distinction matters because panic fades. Planning compounds. On paper, nothing exploded. Markets absorbed it. Commentators shrugged it off. Officials insisted this was normal portfolio management, but this wasn't about yield or diversification in the usual sense. It was about vulnerability, about realizing that assets described as neutral could be frozen, that savings described as secure could be controlled. That participation in the system came with strings no one talked about until they were pulled. If you're thinking this is still just a financial story, hold that thought, because this wasn't the event. It was the symptom, and the mechanism behind it is where the real danger lives. The system doesn't run on trust. It runs on dependency. For years, surplus flowed one way, deficits flowed the other. Goods moved out. Paper claims moved back. Those claims piled up because there was nowhere else large enough, liquid enough, predictable enough to put them. So they accumulated, not by preference, by design. That design worked as long as two things held. First, that the rules would stay neutral. Second, that the center would never use the system itself as leverage. But once assets can be frozen, access delayed, payments blocked, neutrality is gone, what's left is hierarchy. Those closest to the center absorb the benefits: cheap borrowing, lower interest costs, the ability to spend first and adjust later. Those further out absorb the risk: currency exposure, policy decisions they don't control, consequences they didn't vote for. So when a major participant starts quietly rerouting savings, it isn't an attack. It's insulation. Gold instead of promises. Direct settlement instead of intermediaries. Alternatives that don't rely on permission. And here's the part that should unsettle you. This mechanism doesn't require everyone to leave. It only requires enough to prepare. Because once preparation begins, the math for everyone else changes. And that's when stress stops being theoretical. Then the pressure speeds up. Foreign demand softens, not disappears, just weakens. Rates edge higher. Servicing costs rise. Borrowing gets heavier. To cover the gap, the system turns inward. The central bank steps in, buys what others won't, expands its balance sheet. On paper, it's stabilization. In reality, it's substitution. New money replaces old demand. Debt is absorbed, not resolved. And this is where the effects stop being abstract. Prices move first. Food, energy, housing, wages lag. Savings thin out. Purchasing power erodes quietly, unevenly. Asset values lift. Stocks, real estate, anything that absorbs liquidity. Two experiences of the same policy. One feels like protection. The other feels like loss. None of this announces itself as a crisis. It shows up as stress, as exhaustion, as the sense that effort doesn't go as far as it used to. And the loop tightens, because the more the system relies on internal support, the more confidence outside begins to fray, which leads to the part people feel most directly. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, not as a chart, as choices that feel smaller than they used to. You notice it when your paycheck clears and the margin is thinner. When groceries cost more, but nothing feels better. When rent rises faster than explanations. When saving starts to feel like restraint instead of progress. You didn't opt into this. You didn't vote for it. But you're absorbing it. Because when systems adjust under pressure, they don't distribute pain evenly. They pass it downward, quietly. If you hold assets, the system cushions you. If you live on income, it tests you. And here's the unsettling part. What you're experiencing isn't mismanagement, it's signal. A signal that the old balance, borrow freely, spend globally, settle later, is tightening. That the space it once created is narrowing. If this feels personal, it's because it is. This is what systemic change looks like at human scale. Stay with me, because the next phase doesn't stay contained. It spreads. What starts as adjustment doesn't stay domestic, because the system you're inside isn't sealed. It's networked. When confidence shifts at the center, it ripples outward. Trade routes adapt. Settlement choices change. Reserves move. Countries that once parked value in one place begin splitting it, not out of rebellion, out of caution. More trade clears without touching the old center. More agreements bypass familiar channels. More buffers are built where none existed before. Individually, each move looks manageable. Collectively, they redraw the map. Supply chains stretch. Payment timing slows. Volatility creeps into places that used to feel insulated. This isn't fragmentation yet. It's hedging. But hedging changes behavior. It reduces dependence. And reduced dependence weakens influence. The system doesn't collapse when alternatives appear. It erodes. And erosion is harder to fight because there's no single moment to respond to, no switch to flip back, which leaves us facing the question everyone avoids. What happens next when the system accelerates? From here, the future doesn't narrow. It splits. There are three paths, and none of them arrive cleanly. The first is adjustment. The system bends. Borrowing slows. Spending tightens. Influence is shared. The center remains important, but no longer singular. This path requires restraint and time. The second is erosion. Nothing breaks outright. Confidence leaks. Costs creep higher. Alternatives multiply. The system keeps functioning, but with less reach, less margin, less forgiveness. Power fades without ceremony. The third is rupture. Stress compounds. Markets freeze. Rates spike. Debt servicing overwhelms control. What was gradual becomes immediate. Not because someone chose it, but because options ran out. And here's the part no one can predict. These paths don't announce themselves. They overlap. They blur. The system can adjust in one area while eroding in another. It can appear stable right up until it isn't, which is why the most dangerous assumption right now is certainty. Because when a system built on confidence starts testing its limits, the outcome isn't decided by intention. It's decided by timing. And this is where I stop short of resolution. Because the most honest ending here isn't comfort, it's attention. The system you live inside is still functioning. Payments clear. Markets open. Nothing has ended. But the conditions that made it effortless are thinning. When exits exist, leverage changes. When leverage changes, behavior follows. And when behavior shifts at scale, the structure adapts or strains. You don't need to panic, but you do need to notice. Notice what stops being assumed. Notice where confidence quietly reroutes. Notice which costs become normalized. Because this story doesn't conclude with a crash or a villain, it continues with participation. If you want to understand where this goes next, how power reorganizes when certainty dissolves, you can't look away when it gets quieter. That's when the important moves happen. Stay with me. There's more coming.